sometimes the help we need most comes from the hands we least expect to find. Deep in the Blackfoot Valley of Montana, where autumn winds carry the scent of pine and promises of early snow, Clara Whitehorse knelt among scattered branches, her arthritic fingers struggling to lash together a shelter that would barely keep out the rain. 3 months since she'd fled civilization after burying her husband, 3 months of living in her truck and eating cold beans from cans, all because the weight of guilt had made her former life impossible to bear. She'd been one of the best structural engineers in Seattle, bridges, skyscrapers, buildings that stood against earthquakes. But when the shopping center she'd designed collapsed, taking David with it, all her expertise meant nothing. Now she was reduced to this, a broken woman trying to build a cabin from broken wood. That's when she heard the voice behind her. "Ma'am, those branches ain't gonna hold come winter." Clara turned to find a small boy in dusty cowboy boots and a hat that swallowed half his face. In his arms, he carried a stack of perfectly milled timber that should have been impossible for a child to lift. But impossible things, Clara was learning, had a way of finding broken people in broken places. The question wasn't where this mysterious little cowboy had come from, it was whether Clara was ready to accept the help he was offering. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maggie pushed herself to her feet, brushing pine needles from her torn jeans. The sound came again, thunk, pause, thunk, precise and purposeful, cutting through the October stillness like a metronome marking time she couldn't afford to lose. Her grandmother's old Timex read 4:47 p.m. In these mountains, darkness would swallow the forest within the hour. She should ignore it, should focus on salvaging what she could from this latest failure and try again tomorrow. But the rhythm called to something deep in her architect's soul, the part that understood the music of construction, the symphony of measured cuts and perfect joints. Whoever was out there knew what they were doing. Maggie grabbed her grandmother's rusted hatchet from beside the fire ring and followed the sound into the pines. The forest floor crunched beneath her boots, releasing the sharp scent of dying leaves and rich earth. Here, 43 years after Grammy Nora had last walked these deer paths, the wilderness was reclaiming everything. Fence posts swallowed by blackberry vines, the old root cellar barely a depression in the ground. Sometimes Maggie wondered if the land was trying to erase all evidence that humans had ever dared to build here. The axe sounds grew clearer as she pushed through a stand of young firs, definitely an axe, not a mechanical saw. The spacing was too irregular, too human, but who would be hand-cutting timber this deep in the backcountry? The nearest road was a 12-mile hike through terrain that would challenge an experienced woodsman. She rounded a granite outcropping and stopped. There, in a small clearing she'd never seen before, stood neat stacks of cut lumber. 2x4s, 4x4s, even what looked like proper foundation beams. The wood was fresh, pale sawdust still clinging to the cuts, but something about it seemed wrong. Too straight, too perfectly milled for hand tools, and far too much of it for one person to have cut and stacked in a day. The axe sounds had stopped. "Hello?" Her voice echoed off the surrounding trees, smaller and more uncertain than she'd intended. "Is someone there?" Silence pressed back, thick and watchful. A raven called from somewhere overhead, its cry harsh in the stillness. Maggie stepped closer to the lumber stacks, her architect's eye automatically cataloguing dimensions and quality. Quarter-sawn oak, Douglas fir, even some cedar that looked like it had been seasoned for years. The cuts were clean, precise, the work of someone who understood wood grain and structural integrity. She ran her fingers along one of the beams, feeling for tool marks. Her breath caught. The surface was smooth as silk, finished with a care that spoke of old-world craftsmanship, the kind of attention to detail that took time, patience, and skill passed down through generations. A twig snapped behind her. Maggie spun around, hatchet raised, heart hammering against her ribs. The clearing was empty, shadows already deepening between the trees. but she could feel eyes on her, not threatening exactly, but curious, measuring, as if she were being evaluated by some unseen judge. "I don't want any trouble," she called out. "I'm just trying to build a shelter before winter. If this is your land, I'll leave." The wind picked up, setting the pine boughs to whispering. Somewhere in that sound she could have sworn she heard words, too soft to understand, too clear to be imagination. The voice of the forest itself, maybe, or the echo of voices that had spoken here long before she'd ever set foot on Grammy Nora's 40 acres. Maggie backed away from the lumber stacks, but her eyes kept returning to them. Perfect building materials, cut to standard dimensions, appearing where no sawmill had operated for decades. It was impossible. But then again, so was a children's hospital collapsing because of a decimal point error in her load calculations. So was fleeing to the wilderness at 52 to prove she could still build something that wouldn't kill anyone. The last light was fading fast. She needed to get back to her camp, build up the fire, figure out what to do about her collapsed shelter. But as she turned to leave, something made her look back one more time. A small figure stood at the edge of the clearing, there for just an instant before melting back into the shadows, child-sized, wearing what looked like an oversized hat. Too quick to see clearly, too real to dismiss as a trick of the dying light. "Wait!" she called, but the forest had already swallowed whatever she'd seen. Maggie stood alone among the impossible lumber stacks as full darkness settled over the Montana wilderness. Her grandmother had once told stories about these woods, about the homesteaders who'd tried to build lives here and failed, about the man who'd died trying to raise a cabin for his family, lost to an early winter that came without warning. But Grammy Nora had also said something else, something that came back now with the force of prophecy. The land remembers every kindness, Maggie girl. And sometimes, when folks are desperate enough to listen, it gives back. She hefted the hatchet and started the long walk back to her failing camp, wondering what exactly she'd stumbled into and whether she was brave enough to find out. The walk back to camp stretched longer than it should have, every shadow seeming to shift and breathe around her. Maggie's flashlight beam danced ahead, picking out familiar landmarks that suddenly felt foreign, the lightning-split pine she'd used as a marker, the moss-covered boulder where she'd stopped to rest just hours ago. The forest pressed close, alive with sounds she'd learned to ignore during her 3 weeks here, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind through the canopy overhead. But tonight, those sounds felt different, expectant. Her camp, when she finally reached it, looked even more pathetic than she remembered. The tarp she'd strung between 2 trees sagged low, weighed down by accumulated moisture. The foundation of flat stones had shifted, creating gaps that invited every crawling thing in the Montana wilderness to share her sleeping space. The fire ring held only cold ashes and the bitter smell of failure. Maggie dropped the hatchet and sank onto her makeshift log bench, suddenly bone-deep tired, not just from the day's exertions, but from everything that had led her here, the endless depositions, the lawyers who spoke in careful euphemisms about professional liability and structural miscalculations, the faces of the families whose children would have played in that hospital's therapeutic garden if the building hadn't pancaked like a house of cards. She pulled out her cell phone. Still no signal. Hadn't been one since mile marker 7 on the access road, and stared at the dark screen. 3 missed call notifications from yesterday, back when she'd had enough battery to check them. David, probably. Her ex-husband had been trying to reach her since the settlement was finalized, his messages growing more urgent as the media picked up the story. "Come stay with us in Denver," his last voicemail had said, his new wife's voice a concerned murmur in the background. "You don't have to do this alone." But she did have to do this alone. That was the point. Maggie forced herself to rebuild the fire, methodically shredding birch bark for tinder, arranging kindling in the careful pyramid Grammy Nora had taught her 40 years ago during summer visits to this same land. The routine steadied her hands, even as her mind kept circling back to those impossible lumber stacks, quarter-sawn oak didn't grow wild in these mountains. Cedar that perfectly seasoned took years to cure. And the cuts, God, those cuts had been flawless. Better than anything she'd managed with Grammy's old tools. The fire caught, sending sparks spiraling up into the star-drunk sky. Maggie warmed her hands over the flames and tried to make sense of what she'd seen. The logical part of her mind, the part that had once calculated load-bearing requirements for 30-story buildings, offered rational explanations. A logging operation further up the mountain, materials abandoned by previous campers. Hell, maybe the Forest Service maintained some kind of supply depot she didn't know about. But logic couldn't explain the child-sized figure she'd glimpsed, or the feeling that she'd been watched, evaluated, and somehow found, not wanting exactly, but in need. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she'd eaten nothing since the granola bar at dawn. She rummaged through her dwindling supplies, 2 cans of soup, a sleeve of crackers, instant oatmeal enough for maybe 3 more days. She'd planned to hike out for more provisions by now, but every morning brought another collapsed structure, another failure that demanded just one more attempt before she admitted defeat. The truth was, she couldn't afford to keep failing. Not financially. The settlement had left her with enough to survive, barely, but spiritually. At 52, after 26 years of designing buildings that sheltered and healed and inspired, she'd become the architect whose miscalculation had endangered children. The professional journals wouldn't say it outright, but the implication was clear: her career was over. Insurance wouldn't cover her. Firms wouldn't hire her. She was architectural poison, a walking reminder that even experienced professionals could make catastrophic mistakes. So she'd come here to Grammy Nora's land to prove something to herself, that she could still build, that her hands remembered what her mind had apparently forgotten, that somewhere in the Montana wilderness, far from lawyers and reporters and the rubble of her reputation, Margaret Holloway could construct something solid and true and safe. Instead, everything she'd attempted had collapsed. Maggie opened one of the soup cans and set it on the camp grate to heat, watching steam rise into the firelight. Tomorrow she'd have to make a decision, hike out for supplies and admit this was just an expensive camping trip, or what? Chase shadows and mysterious lumber stacks? Trust in Grammy's old stories about land that remembered and gave back? The soup bubbled, filling the air with the artificial smell of chicken and preservatives. Somewhere in the darkness beyond her fire's reach, a twig snapped, just once, deliberate as a footstep. Maggie looked up from her meal, listening, but the forest had gone quiet again, almost as if something small and watchful had settled in to wait. Maggie sat frozen, spoon halfway to her mouth, listening to the profound silence that followed that single, deliberate snap. Not the random crackle of settling wood or the scurry of small animals. This had been purposeful, measured, human. "Hello?" she called softly, her voice barely carrying beyond the fire's glow. "I know someone's there." The darkness seemed to pulse with held breath. Then, at the very edge of her firelight, a shadow detached itself from the trees, small, child-sized, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who understood the difference between being seen and being noticed. Maggie's heart hammered as the figure stepped closer, revealing details that made no sense. A boy, maybe 8 years old, wearing a battered cowboy hat that sat too large on his head and boots that had seen hard use. His clothes, denim overalls and a flannel shirt, looked like they belonged in an old photograph, worn but well cared for. Most unsettling of all, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone far older, his pale eyes studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Ma'am." He touched the brim of his hat with old-fashioned politeness. "Saw your fire from the ridge. Figured you could use some help with your building." Maggie set down her soup can with trembling hands. The boy's voice carried the faint trace of an accent she couldn't place. Not quite southern, not quite western, but something older, more formal, and there was an echo to it, as if his words were bouncing off canyon walls she couldn't see. "You're just a child," she managed. "Where are your parents? How did you get way out here?" The boy's smile was gentle but somehow ancient. Papa's working the high timber. Says there's a lady down here who's forgotten how to build proper. Says maybe it's time I learned her some things. Taught, Maggie corrected automatically, then felt foolish. You mean taught you some things? No, ma'am. He stepped closer, and she caught the scent of sawdust and pine sap, so strong it made her dizzy. Papa says I'm to teach you, about foundations that hold, about wood that remembers what it's meant to be. This was impossible, insane. There was no way a child this young could have cut and stacked that lumber, no way he'd hiked 12 miles through wilderness, no way he could know about her failures. Yet when he looked at her, she saw something that made her architect's training sing with recognition. The eyes of someone who understood structure, stability, the sacred geometry of load and balance. "What's your name?" she whispered. "Tommy." He glanced toward the collapsed remains of her latest shelter attempt. "You've been using broken wood for broken purposes. Can't build something new out of something that's already failed." The words hit like a physical blow. "What did you say?" "That lumber you've been gathering, it's all windfall and deadwood, already gave up its strength to the storm that brought it down." Tommy walked to her pile of salvaged branches, his small hands running along them with professional assessment. "Can't make a home out of something that's already died." Maggie stood on unsteady legs. "How could you possibly know?" "Same way Papa knew you'd come here. Same way he knew you'd need help." Tommy turned those two old eyes on her again. "You built something that fell down and hurt folks. Now you're trying to build again, but you're using the same broken pieces, the same broken thinking, going to get the same broken results." The night air suddenly felt thin, hard to breathe. "Who told you about what happened to me?" "The land tells stories to them that listen." Tommy picked up one of her salvaged boards, a piece of pine she'd pulled from a fallen tree. As his fingers traced the wood grain, it seemed to crumble slightly, releasing a shower of wood dust and the smell of rot. "This here's been dead for years, even when it was still standing. You can't build truth on a foundation of lies." "That doesn't make any sense," Maggie said, but her voice cracked. Because it did make sense, in a way that bypassed logic and went straight to the guilt she'd been carrying. She had been trying to rebuild her confidence using the same methods that had failed before, the same shortcuts, the same assumptions, the same refusal to acknowledge that maybe she'd been fundamentally wrong about something essential. Tommy dropped the rotting board and brushed the dust from his small hands. "Papa's got good timber cut and seasoned proper, wood that's been waiting for the right purpose. But he says you got to want to build something new, not just prove you can build the same old thing that already failed." He started walking back toward the tree line, his oversized hat bobbing with each step. "You think on it, ma'am. Tomorrow morning, if you're ready to learn instead of just trying to remember, you come back to that clearing. Bring your tools, but leave your old ideas behind." "Wait!" Maggie called after him. "Tommy, wait! Where are you going? How will I find you?" But the boy had already melted back into the shadows, leaving only the lingering scent of sawdust and the echo of words that cut deeper than any lawyer's cross-examination. "You can't build truth on a foundation of lies." Maggie stood alone by her dying fire, staring at the spot where the impossible boy had vanished. The scent of sawdust still hung in the air, so thick she could taste it on her tongue. She touched the rotting board Tommy had crumbled in his small hands. It was still there, still real, the wood dust gritty between her fingers like accusation made manifest. "You can't build truth on a foundation of lies." She sank back onto her log bench, legs suddenly unsteady. The child's words echoed in her mind, mixing with other voices from the past year. The structural engineer who'd testified against her, explaining to a hushed courtroom how a single miscalculation had cascaded through her entire design. The hospital administrator who'd spoken of trust betrayed, of children who would never play in gardens that no longer existed. What if Tommy was right? What if she'd been trying to rebuild using the same broken thinking that had failed her before? The fire popped, sending sparks into the darkness. Maggie fed it another stick with mechanical precision while her mind raced. She'd come here to prove she could still build something, anything that wouldn't collapse. but every attempt had used salvaged materials, shortcuts, the kind of corner cutting that had gotten her into trouble in the first place. Grammy Nora's land was supposed to give her a fresh start, not force her to confront the uncomfortable truth that maybe the problem wasn't just bad luck or a single calculation error. Maybe the problem was her. She pulled her knees to her chest, suddenly cold despite the fire's warmth. Going back to that clearing tomorrow would mean admitting she needed help, not just with construction, but with something deeper. It would mean acknowledging that Margaret Holloway, licensed architect with 26 years of experience, had something fundamental to learn from a child who shouldn't exist. The rational part of her mind offered safer alternatives. Pack up tomorrow, hike out, drive back to Denver and accept David's offer of his guest room. Start over in a new field, teaching maybe or consulting. Something where the worst mistake would be embarrassment, not catastrophe. But the thought of retreat made her stomach clench with familiar shame. She'd already run once, fleeing the lawsuits and media attention for the supposed sanctuary of Grammy's wilderness. How many times could she reinvent herself before there was nothing left to rebuild? A coyote called from somewhere up the ridge, its voice wild and lonesome. The sound raised goosebumps on her arms, reminding her how far she was from help if something went wrong. 3 weeks alone in the mountains had taught her that the forest didn't care about her professional reputation or personal demons. It only cared whether she was strong enough to survive what it demanded. Tomorrow's decision felt like another kind of survival test. Maggie stirred the coals with a stick, watching sparks spiral into the star-drunk sky. In the dancing light, she could almost see Tommy's 2 old eyes, the way he'd assessed her failures with professional detachment. No judgment, just diagnosis. You've been using broken wood for broken purposes. As if the solution was that simple. Throw away everything damaged and start fresh. But what if she was the broken wood? What if 26 years of professional confidence had been built on foundations as rotten as those salvaged boards? The thought terrified her more than any ghost child or mysterious lumber stacks. She'd spent her adult life believing in her competence, her careful methodologies, her ability to translate vision into reality through mathematics and engineering principles. The hospital collapse had shattered that faith, but she'd been trying to rebuild it using the same tools, the same assumptions. Maybe that was why nothing stayed standing. A barn owl called from the darkness beyond her fire, its voice hollow as wind through empty buildings. Maggie shivered and added more wood to the flames. The night pressed close around her small circle of warmth, full of watching shadows and impossible promises. She could sleep on it. Morning might bring clarity, or at least the courage to make a choice. But even as she told herself this, she knew she'd already decided. The clearing called to her like an architectural puzzle she couldn't solve, and Tommy's offer of properly seasoned timber sang to her builder's soul. Tomorrow she'd go back. She'd bring Grammy's old tools and whatever remained of her professional pride. But first, she'd have to find the strength to leave behind everything she thought she knew about construction, about failure, about the weight of other people's trust. The fire settled lower, casting longer shadows. Somewhere in those shadows, Maggie thought she glimpsed a small figure in an oversized hat, waiting patiently for her answer. But when she blinked, there was only darkness and the eternal whisper of pine boughs overhead. "Build something new," Tommy had said. "Not just prove you can build the same old thing that already failed." She pulled her sleeping bag closer and settled in to wait for dawn. Dawn came pale and cold, filtering through pine needles in silver shafts that cut through the last wisps of her dying fire. Maggie had slept fitfully, waking every hour to feed the coals and stare into the darkness where Tommy had vanished. Now, with morning light revealing the familiar landscape of her failures, collapsed shelters, scattered tools, the accusatory pile of rotting lumber, she felt the weight of decisions settle on her shoulders like a physical thing. Her breath misted in the crisp air as she rolled up her sleeping bag with mechanical precision. Each movement felt deliberate, ceremonial, as if she were preparing for something more significant than a hike through the woods. Her hand shook slightly as she loaded Grammy Nora's tools into the canvas bag, The hand plane worn smooth by decades of use, chisels that still held their edge, the level with its brass fittings green with age but true as ever. "Leave your old ideas behind," Tommy had said. "But how did you abandon everything you thought you knew about your own profession?" The question followed her as she shouldered the tool bag and started toward the tree line. With each step away from her campsite, she felt something loosening in her chest, not relief exactly, but a strange lightness that came from finally moving forward instead of circling endlessly around her failures. The morning forest was alive with bird calls and the rustle of small creatures, but underneath it all she sensed a deeper watchfulness, as if the land itself were holding its breath. The path to the clearing wasn't visible in daylight, but her feet seemed to remember the way. Past the lightning-split cedar, down the slope where wild huckleberries grew thick as promises, through stands of timber so old and tall they made her feel like a child again. With each step, the familiar weight of her professional identity seemed to slip away, leaving something raw and more honest behind. She found herself thinking about Grammy Nora, who'd homesteaded this land with nothing but determination and a handful of hand tools. No architectural degree, no engineering calculations, no liability insurance, just an understanding of how wood wanted to be shaped, how stone preferred to rest, how a building could grow from the land like something that belonged there. Grammy's cabin had stood for 60 years before the fire took it, weathering storms that had leveled modern constructions, built with all the advantages of contemporary technology. Maybe that was the lesson she'd been too proud to learn. The clearing opened before her like a secret revealed, morning sunlight slanting through the canopy to illuminate the impossible lumber stacks. In daylight they looked even more perfect. Boards cut to precise dimensions, timber seasoned to exactly the right moisture content, joints so clean they might have been machine-milled. But there was something organic about the way they'd been arranged, as if whoever had placed them understood not just technical specifications, but the timber's own desires. Tommy sat cross-legged on a cedar log, his oversized hat casting his face in shadow. He looked up as she approached, those ancient eyes taking in her loaded tool bag with quiet approval. "Figured you'd come," he said simply. "Papa's been waiting." Maggie set down the tools and looked around the clearing, seeing it now with different eyes. The space wasn't just randomly chosen, it was perfectly positioned to catch morning light while staying sheltered from prevailing winds. The ground was level, but with subtle drainage that would keep a foundation dry. Even the existing trees formed natural supports for a structure that worked with the landscape instead of fighting it. "What exactly are we building?" she asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Tommy stood and walked to the nearest lumber stack, his small hands running along the wood grain with professional familiarity. "Something that'll hold," he said. "Something that remembers what it's for." He began pulling boards from the stack, selecting them with the instinctive knowledge of someone who understood each piece's particular strengths. Maggie watched, fascinated despite herself, as he laid out the beginning of what she slowly recognized as a traditional post and beam frame, the kind of construction Grammy's generation had used, where every joint was cut by hand and fitted with mathematical precision. "But the calculations," she began, then stopped. Because standing here in the morning light, surrounded by timber that seemed to hum with potential, she realized that some kinds of knowledge couldn't be reduced to formulas. Some buildings grew from understanding that went deeper than engineering tables and load calculations. Understanding that honored the materials, the site, the purpose. Tommy looked up at her with those two old eyes. "You ready to learn?" he asked. Maggie knelt beside him and opened Grammy's tool bag. The familiar weight of the hand plane felt different in her palm now, not just an instrument of professional competence, but a bridge between what she'd lost and what she might yet become. Around them, the forest watched and waited as she crossed the threshold between the architect she'd been and the builder she was willing to become. "Yes," she said quietly. "I'm ready." Tommy nodded and selected a length of Douglas fir from the stack, running his small fingers along its length as if reading stories written in the grain. "First thing Papa taught me," he said, settling the board across two sawhorses that Maggie was certain hadn't been there moments before, is that wood's got memory. This here piece remembers the mountain where it grew, the storms it weathered, the seasons it counted. You got to listen to what it's telling you before you decide what to ask of it. Maggie lifted the hand plane from Grammy's tool bag, its worn wooden body warm against her palm. "I know how to use this," she began, but Tommy shook his head. "Not the way Papa needs you to." He placed his small hands over hers on the tool, and suddenly the plane felt different, heavier, more alive, connected to something larger than her own intentions. "Feel that?" She did feel it, a subtle resistance that hadn't been there before, as if the tool itself were evaluating her worthiness. When she tried to push forward with her usual confident stroke, the blade caught and skittered across the wood surface, leaving an ugly gouge. "You're fighting it," Tommy observed without criticism, "trying to make it do what you want instead of what it knows how to do." Maggie's cheeks burned with embarrassment. 26 years of professional experience, and she was being corrected by a child on the most basic woodworking technique. But something in Tommy's patient expression reminded her of her promise to leave her old ideas behind. "Show me," she said quietly. Tommy guided her hands again, but this time he didn't try to control the movement. Instead, he helped her find the grain's natural direction, the angle where the blade wanted to cut rather than tear. The difference was immediate. The plane sang through the wood, peeling off gossamer-thin shavings that curled like golden ribbons. "There," Tommy said with satisfaction. "Now you're asking instead of demanding." The morning passed in strange lessons that challenged everything Maggie thought she knew about construction. When she tried to measure cuts with her tape measure and square, Tommy showed her how to use the wood itself as a guide, marking lengths by holding boards against each other, checking angles by how the shadows fell, trusting proportions that felt right rather than calculated precisely. "But we need to ensure load distribution," Maggie protested when Tommy began laying out what looked like an impossibly delicate frame structure. "The stress calculations—" "Papa says stress comes from fighting your nature, not honoring it." Tommy selected another board with that uncanny instinct for choosing exactly the right piece. "Look here." He pointed to where two timbers would join, and Maggie saw that the natural curve of the wood grain created strength exactly where it would be needed most. The joint wasn't engineered so much as discovered, as if the trees had grown knowing they would someday support each other in exactly this way. "It's beautiful," she admitted, "but—" Her words were cut off by the sound of approaching voices. Through the trees came three men in hard hats and safety vests, their heavy boots crashing through undergrowth with the subtlety of machinery. The lead man carried a clipboard and surveying equipment, his face set in the expression of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Ma'am, you need to clear this area immediately," he called out as they entered the clearing. "This is a designated timber sale zone. Logging operations begin Monday." Maggie felt the world tilt sideways. There must be some mistake. This is private land, my grandmother's property. The man consulted his clipboard with bureaucratic certainty. "Nora Holloway's 40 acres were sold for back taxes last month. New owners have mineral and timber rights." He glanced around the clearing, his gaze passing right through the lumber stacks as if they weren't there. "You're trespassing." "That's impossible." But even as she said it, Maggie remembered the stack of unopened mail she'd left behind in Denver, the bills and legal notices she'd been too overwhelmed to face. "The taxes weren't that much behind." "Doesn't matter now. You've got until Friday to remove any personal property, then we're clear-cutting this whole section." The man turned to go, then paused. "And ma'am, I'd be real careful about any construction projects out here. Liability issues, you understand." The words hit like a physical blow. Maggie sank onto the cedar log where Tommy had been sitting, watching the men disappear back into the forest. When she looked around for the boy, she found only empty air and the impossible lumber stacks that somehow the officials hadn't seen. "Tommy?" she called, her voice cracking. "Tommy, what do we do now?" The wind through the pines might have carried an answer, But if it did, the words were in a language she didn't yet know how to speak. The silence that followed felt heavier than the lumber stacks around her. Maggie pressed her palms against the cedar log, trying to anchor herself against the vertigo of loss compounding upon loss. First her career, then her confidence, now Grammy Nora's land. The last sanctuary she'd believed was hers by right of blood and memory. She pulled herself upright on unsteady legs, surveying the clearing with new eyes. Every board, every carefully planned joint, every lesson Tommy had just taught her, all of it would be reduced to sawdust and stumps by Monday's chainsaws. The irony tasted bitter. Just when she'd begun to understand what building really meant, the ground itself was being stolen from beneath her foundation. "This can't happen," she whispered to the empty air. But the unopened mail pile in her Denver apartment rose in her memory like an accusation. How many certified letters had she ignored? How many final notices had she tossed aside while drowning in grief over the hospital collapse? She'd been so focused on escaping her professional failure that she'd failed to protect the one thing that mattered most. The morning sun felt suddenly cold against her skin. Friday. 5 days to salvage what she could and abandon the rest. 5 days to watch another structure in her life crumble before it could even be completed. She found herself walking to the nearest lumber stack, running her hands along the impossibly perfect boards the way Tommy had shown her. The wood felt warm, almost alive, humming with potential that would soon be silenced forever. Her fingers traced the grain patterns, memorizing the stories Tommy said were written there, stories of seasons endured, of slow growth toward the light, of patience that stretched across decades, stories that would end with the scream of industrial saws. "Ma'am?" The voice made her jump. She turned to find one of the officials had returned, the younger one who'd hung back while his supervisor delivered the eviction notice. His hard hat was tucked under his arm, and his expression held something that might have been sympathy. "Look, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but—" He glanced over his shoulder, then stepped closer. The sale was rushed through. Nora Holloway's family should have been given more time to respond. If you can prove kinship and bring the back taxes current, there might be grounds for an appeal. Maggie's heart stuttered. How much time? For the appeal? 30 days, maybe 60 if you get a good lawyer. But, he shook his head grimly, the logging contract's already signed. They'll clear-cut first and sort out the legal mess later. By the time any court hearing happens, there won't be much left to save. He settled his hard hat back in place, transforming from reluctant ally back to corporate functionary. "I'm sorry. I know what this land meant to her. My grandmother used to bring me berrying here when I was little. Nora always let the local kids pick huckleberries." After he disappeared into the forest, Maggie sank back onto the log, her mind racing through impossible calculations. The back taxes couldn't be more than a few $1,000s, manageable if she liquidated her remaining savings, but hiring a lawyer, filing appeals, navigating bureaucracy that moved like geological time while chainsaws moved like lightning, that was a gamble she couldn't afford to lose. The wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of diesel engines warming up. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the machinery was already positioning itself for Monday's assault. She imagined the ancient trees falling with thunderous crashes, the delicate ecosystem of the clearing torn apart by tracks and cables, the lumber stacks that defied explanation buried under industrial debris. "Tommy?" she called again, her voice stronger now. "I know you're here somewhere. I know you can hear me." Only the whisper of pine needles answered, but she pressed on anyway. "I don't understand what you are or how any of this is possible, but I understand what you're trying to teach me, about building something that honors the materials instead of forcing them, about listening instead of demanding." She stood and walked to where they'd begun laying out the frame, kneeling to touch the joints Tommy had shown her. Even half-assembled, the structure possessed an integrity that transcended engineering principles, a rightness that came from working with natural forces instead of conquering them. But what's the point if it all gets destroyed anyway? What's the point of learning to build if there's nowhere left to build? The clearing held its breath around her question. Then, so faintly she might have imagined it, she heard the sound of wood shavings falling to forest floor. When she looked up, Tommy stood at the far edge of the lumber stack, his small figure backlit by filtered sunlight. "Papa says," he called across the distance between them, his voice carrying with impossible clarity, "sometimes you got to build fast as you can before the storm hits, even if all you get is the foundation." His words hung in the morning air like a challenge. 5 days. Could they frame the basic structure in 5 days? Could she learn enough of Tommy's impossible lessons to create something worth saving before the chainsaws arrived? The answer came not from her architect's training, but from something deeper. The same stubbornness that had driven Grammy Nora to homestead this wilderness, that had sustained her through 60 years of Montana winters. "Then we'd better get started," Maggie called back, reaching for Grammy's tools with hands that no longer trembled. Tommy moved toward her with that strange fluidity that made him seem less like walking than materializing, each step bringing him more solidly into the world. As he drew closer, Maggie noticed something different about him, an urgency that hadn't been there before, as if time itself were pressing against his small frame. "5 days ain't much," he said, kneeling beside the foundation layout. "But Papa built his whole cabin in 3 when the blizzard of 22 came early. Course, he had to live in it come January with gaps still showing between the logs." Maggie lifted the handplane, testing its weight in her palm. The morning lessons felt like years ago instead of hours. What happened to him? To Papa? Tommy's hands stilled on the timber he'd been selecting. Wasn't the cabin that failed him? Was his heart come spring, but the cabin held through that winter and 6 more after, till the forest took it back peaceful-like. The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning, and Maggie found herself thinking about the hospital again, not the twisted metal and concrete dust of its collapse, but the children's ward she'd designed with butterfly windows and reading nooks carved into alcoves. The investigators had focused on load calculations and material specifications, but she'd dreamed of spaces that would help small patients heal faster, that would let in light instead of just keeping out weather. "I killed 3 children," she said suddenly, the words scraping her throat raw. "My building fell down and killed 3 children who were supposed to get better and go home." Tommy looked up at her with those ancient eyes, and she saw no judgment there, only a patience deeper than the surrounding pines. "Papa says the worst thing ain't failing. It's stopping before you learn what the failure's trying to teach you. What could it possibly teach me? That I'm not good enough? That I don't understand materials and stress loads and safety margins?" Her voice cracked, and she realized she was gripping the plane so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Those children trusted grown-ups to build something safe for them, and we failed them. Did you build it wrong on purpose? The question was so simple it nearly knocked her over. Of course not. I would never. Then you ain't the only one who failed, are you? Maggie stared at him, her mind racing through the investigation reports she'd memorized in sleepless midnight hours. The contaminated concrete batch that hadn't been properly tested. The inspector who'd signed off on work he'd never actually examined. The contractor who'd substituted cheaper rebar without updating the engineering calculations. Her design had been the foundation, but the failure had grown from a dozen small betrayals of responsibility. But I should have caught it. I should have been there, should have supervised every pore, every connection. Should have done everybody else's job too. Tommy selected another board, his small hands reading the wood grain with practiced familiarity. "Papa says a building's like a conversation between lots of folks. Architect, carpenter, stonemason, the fellow who cuts the trees. When one voice lies, the whole conversation goes wrong." He positioned the timber against the foundation layout, and Maggie saw how it would work. A corner post that would bear the weight of the entire structure, its natural curve perfectly placed to direct stress down into the earth rather than fighting it. But that don't mean you stop talking. Just means you got to learn to hear when someone's lying. The sound of distant machinery grew louder, and Maggie felt time compressing around them like a vice. Friday. 5 days to build something worth saving, but also 5 days to understand what salvation might actually mean. She knelt beside Tommy and reached for the mortise chisel, surprised by how natural it felt in her grip. "Teach me," she said. "Teach me to hear the truth." Tommy nodded and guided her hands to the timber's end, where a joint would need to be cut. "First thing is listening to what the wood wants to tell you. This here piece grew on a slope, see? One side faced the storm winds, made it strong and tight. Other side reached for the sun, made it flexible. You got to honor both parts." As Maggie began to work the chisel, she found herself thinking about the children's hospital in a new way, not as a monument to her failure, but as an unfinished conversation about healing and hope and the responsibility of creating spaces where vulnerable people could feel safe. The building had fallen, yes, but the conversation didn't have to end there. "What if we can't finish?" she asked, pausing to wipe sweat from her forehead. Around them, the forest seemed to lean closer, as if the trees themselves were invested in the answer. Tommy smiled for the first time since the officials had left, and for a moment his face looked exactly like what he appeared to be, an 8-year-old boy with dirt under his fingernails and absolute faith in the possibility of tomorrow. "Then we build as far as we can and trust someone else to finish the conversation." The chisel slipped in Maggie's grip, gouging a ragged scar across the timber's end. She cursed under her breath and set the tool down, flexing fingers that had begun to cramp from the unfamiliar work. 3 hours of patient instruction from Tommy, and she still couldn't manage the simplest joint without damaging the wood. "I'm not getting it," she said, frustration bleeding into her voice. "This is exactly what happened with the hospital, thinking I understood something when I didn't, pushing forward when I should have slowed down." Tommy examined the damaged timber without reproach, running his small fingers along the gouged wood. "This piece can still work. Just got to adjust where the joint sits, honor the new shape." But Maggie was already spiraling, her architect's eye cataloguing everything going wrong. The foundation stones she'd laid that morning sat slightly uneven, despite multiple adjustments. The corner posts they'd selected looked impossibly delicate for the loads they'd need to bear, and the damaged timber in her hands felt like prophecy. Another structure she'd destroy through incompetence and haste. "We're fooling ourselves," she said, standing abruptly and walking to the edge of the clearing. Through the trees, she could see surveyors' ribbons tied to trunks marked for cutting, bright orange strips that fluttered like surrender flags in the afternoon breeze. 5 days to learn a lifetime of skills? 5 days to build something that won't collapse the moment we're gone? The sound of machinery had grown steadily louder throughout the day. Now she could identify individual engines, the deeper rumble of bulldozers, the high whine of hydraulic systems warming up. They were positioning equipment just beyond the ridge, preparing for Monday's systematic destruction. Every minute brought the chainsaws closer to this impossible sanctuary of perfect lumber and patient lessons. "Tommy, what are we even doing here?" She turned back toward where the boy had been working, but found only empty space and scattered wood shavings. "Tommy?" The forest held its silence like a held breath. No footsteps, no voice calling back, no sign that the mysterious child had ever existed except for the lumber stacks that shouldn't be there and the half-begun joints that her clumsy hands couldn't hope to complete. Panic rose in her chest, not just at Tommy's disappearance, but at what it meant. Without his guidance, she was just a failed architect alone in the wilderness with a pile of boards and 5 days until eviction. All the morning's lessons felt suddenly fragile, like trying to hold water in cupped palms. She could remember the feeling of the chisel moving with the grain instead of against it, but couldn't recreate the technique without Tommy's hands guiding hers. The damaged timber lay where she dropped it, its gouged end a testament to her limitations. She picked it up again, testing its weight, trying to hear what Tommy claimed the wood was saying. But all she heard was the approaching rumble of machinery and the whisper of wind through trees that would be stumps by week's end. Her phone buzzed, a text message that had somehow found signal in this remote corner of Montana. The contractor from Denver, demanding final payment for materials delivered to the hospital site before its collapse. Another bill, another creditor, Another failure demanding acknowledgement and restitution. She'd fled to this wilderness to escape such reminders, but debt followed like gravity, inescapable and constant. The numbers on her banking app told their own story of diminishing options. Even if she could raise the back taxes to contest the land sale, legal fees would drain her remaining resources within weeks. And for what? To save 40 acres that would be scarred beyond recognition by logging equipment? To preserve a clearing that existed only in her memory and an old woman's fading stories? She sank onto the cedar log that had become her thinking spot, her phone still glowing with financial devastation. Around her, the lumber stacks caught the late afternoon light, each board seemingly chosen by impossible knowledge and cut with precision that defied explanation. Tommy's lessons echoed in her memory, about listening instead of demanding, about building with materials instead of against them, about conversations that could span generations. But conversations required participants, and she was alone now with darkness gathering between the trees. A sound made her look up, not Tommy's footsteps, but the diesel growl of a logging truck negotiating the narrow forest road, testing access routes, checking weight limits, preparing for Monday's assault. The sound grew louder, then faded as the truck completed its circuit and rumbled back toward civilization. In the silence that followed, Maggie finally understood what she'd lost. Not just Grammy Nora's land or the mysterious boy's teachings, but the fragile hope that she might build something good again, that her hands might create instead of destroy, might honor materials instead of forcing them into submission. The damaged timber in her lap felt heavier than its physical weight, heavy with all the structures she'd never complete, all the conversations she'd never learn to hear. Around her, the lumber stacks waited in perfect stillness, their impossible presence now feeling less like magic and more like mockery. The cedar log beneath her had grown cold with evening settling over the clearing, but Maggie remained motionless, staring at the damaged timber in her lap. The gouged wood seemed to pulse with her failures, the hospital's twisted rebar, the children's trust betrayed, and now this simple joint she couldn't cut without destroying what Tommy had carefully selected. But as darkness deepened between the trees, something shifted in her perception. The lumber stacks around her didn't just represent impossible craftsmanship, they represented choices. Someone had selected each board, shaped each joint, arranged them here for a purpose that transcended logic, and that someone had been teaching her day by day to see beyond her own limitations. Maggie stood slowly, her architect's eye tracing the layout they'd begun that morning. The foundation stones she'd criticized as uneven actually followed the natural contours of the land, creating a platform that worked with the slope instead of fighting it. The corner posts that had seemed too delicate were positioned to let the structure flex with seasonal movement, like the trees that had survived decades of Montana storms by bending instead of breaking. "I've been seeing it all wrong," she whispered to the empty clearing. The realization hit her like cold mountain air filling her lungs. She'd been measuring Tommy's teachings against conventional construction standards, looking for the rigid precision of architectural drawings when he'd been showing her something entirely different. The joints didn't need to be perfect, they needed to be honest. The structure didn't need to conquer the landscape, it needed to inhabit it. She picked up the damaged timber, examining the scar her chisel had left. Instead of seeing failure, she began to see possibility. The gouge created a natural channel that could accept a different kind of connection, one that might actually be stronger for acknowledging the wood's wounded history. Like the hospital collapse had wounded her, marking her with visible damage that would always be part of her story. But wounds could become wisdom if you learned to build around them, instead of pretending they didn't exist. "Tommy," she called into the darkness, her voice steady now. "I know you're listening. I know you've been trying to show me something I wasn't ready to see." The forest rustled with night sounds, but underneath them she heard something else. The whisper of wood shavings falling, rhythmic as breathing. When she turned toward the sound, Tommy materialized at the edge of the nearest lumber stack, his small figure glowing faintly in the starlight. "Papa says," he called across the distance, You finally stopped trying to build like the hospital folks wanted and started thinking about what the building actually needed. Maggie felt tears she hadn't known she was holding spill down her cheeks. The hospital. It wasn't just my failure, was it? You've been trying to tell me that from the beginning. Tommy moved closer, his ancient eyes reflecting depths of understanding that belonged to someone much older than 8 years. Papa says every building's got 2 stories, the one the architects and contractors and inspectors tell themselves, and the one the building knows is true. What was the hospital's true story? That it wanted to heal children, same as you did. But too many folks stopped listening to what it needed and started listening to what they wanted. Faster schedules, cheaper materials, corners that could be cut without nobody noticing. Tommy knelt beside the foundation layout, his hands moving over the stones with familiar reverence. Building knew it couldn't do its job right, but nobody asked what it was trying to say. The diesel rumble of machinery had faded, leaving the clearing wrapped in mountain silence. But instead of feeling ominous, the quiet now felt expectant, as if the forest itself was waiting for her next choice. Maggie looked at the lumber stacks, the half-assembled foundation, the tools Grammy Nora had left behind like an inheritance of possibility. "What about this building?" she asked. "What's its true story?" Tommy smiled, and for a moment he looked exactly like what he appeared to be, a child delighted by a grown-up who had finally asked the right question. This one knows it might not get finished before the machines come, but it also knows that ain't the only way a building can matter. Maggie felt understanding bloom in her chest like warmth spreading from a banked fire. The cabin didn't need to be completed to serve its purpose. It needed to be begun with integrity, built with materials that were honored rather than forced, constructed according to principles that recognize the conversation between human need and natural possibility. "It's not about finishing," she said, the words emerging from somewhere deeper than thought. "It's about building something true. Now you're hearing what Papa's been trying to tell you since you got here." Around them, the lumber stacks seemed to pulse with renewed purpose, their impossible presence no longer mocking but encouraging. 5 days until the chainsaws arrived. 5 days to build not just a structure, but an understanding of what it meant to create something that honored both its materials and its maker. 5 days to finish a conversation that had begun with a hospital-esque collapse and would continue long after this clearing fell silent. Maggie woke before dawn, her body stiff from sleeping on the cabin floor, but her mind sharper than it had been in months. The conversation with Tommy had shifted something fundamental in her understanding, like a foundation settling into true alignment. She dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, pulled on Grammy Nora's work boots, and stepped into the clearing where starlight still gleamed off the lumber stacks. 5 days. The number no longer felt like a countdown to defeat, but a deadline that would focus every choice, every cut, every joint. She had built her entire career around impossible deadlines and demanding clients, but this was different. This was building for the conversation itself, not just the structure that might emerge from it. She lit the Coleman lantern and began organizing tools with methodical precision. The mortise chisel that had slipped in her grip yesterday, the hand plane that Tommy had guided her fingers around, the measuring square that Grammy Nora had worn smooth with decades of use. Each tool represented knowledge accumulated over lifetimes, and she was finally ready to listen to what they had to teach her. Early start today, Tommy's voice emerged from the shadows beyond the lumber stacks. He materialized holding an armload of kindling, his too large hat askew and wood shavings caught in his dark hair. "Papa says folks build best when they work with the light instead of racing against it." "Then we'll work with whatever light we have," Maggie replied, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "And when it gets dark, we'll keep working by lantern. This building wants to be started properly, even if we can't finish it." Tommy nodded approvingly and began arranging the kindling for a small fire. "Papa always said the difference between good builders and great ones ain't how fast they work. It's whether they remember that every board was once a living tree, every stone was once part of a mountain. Materials got their own history, and that history wants to be honored. As flames caught and spread warmth through the clearing, Maggie found herself seeing the lumber stacks with new eyes. Each board represented not just timber, but decades of growth, seasons of weather, the slow accumulation of strength that happened when roots found purchase in rocky soil. Tommy had somehow gathered materials that carried their own stories, and her job was to help those stories continue rather than forcing them into submission. "Where do we start?" she asked, settling beside the foundation stones they'd laid the previous day. "With what wants to be built first," Tommy replied. He moved to the largest lumber stack and selected a massive beam that seemed to glow in the firelight. Corner post for the southwest corner. This one grew on a ridge where it faced storms from 3 directions, so it knows how to hold steady when things get difficult. Together, they lifted the beam and positioned it against the foundation layout. Maggie felt its weight and density, the way its grain ran straight and true despite the challenging conditions that had shaped its growth. This wasn't generic construction lumber. This was a tree that had learned resilience through adversity and now wanted to teach that lesson to the structure they were building. "The hospital beam," she said suddenly, understanding flooding through her, the one that failed. It wasn't just contaminated concrete. The steel was wrong too, wasn't it? Cheap material that looked strong but hadn't been tested properly. Tommy guided her hands to the mortise that would need to be cut in the beam's top end. "Papa says materials don't lie, but folks sure do. When someone tells you a beam can carry more weight than it wants to, when someone says concrete's cured proper when it ain't, when someone signs papers about work they never actually checked, that's when buildings start whispering warnings. And I didn't know how to listen. You knew something was wrong. Papa says you felt it every time you walked through that building site, saw how the workers rushed past problems instead of fixing them, noticed how the inspector never spent enough time checking what he was supposed to check." Tommy positioned the chisel against the beam and showed her the angle. "But you didn't trust what the building was trying to tell you." Maggie began cutting the mortise, her movements more careful than the previous day, but also more confident. The chisel moved with the wood grain instead of against it, removing material in clean curls that fell to the ground like offerings. Around them, the forest began to lighten with approaching dawn, but the firelight continued to cast dancing shadows that made their work feel timeless. "This building," she said as she worked, "it's not going to whisper warnings, is it? This building's got materials that want to be here, got makers who know how to listen, got a purpose that honors what came before." Tommy's voice carried absolute certainty. "This building's going to sing." Dawn broke over the clearing as Maggie completed her first clean mortise joint, the wood fitting together with satisfying precision. Around them, the lumber stacks seemed to straighten with renewed purpose, ready to become part of something larger than themselves. 4.5 days remaining, and finally she was ready to build. The clean mortise joint felt solid beneath Maggie's hands as she tested the connection one final time. 4.5 days. The number pulsed through her consciousness like a heartbeat, but for the first time since arriving at Grammy Nora's land, urgency felt like momentum rather than panic. She was building now, truly building, and the difference showed in every measured cut, every careful selection of materials. "What's next?" she asked, stepping back to survey their progress. The corner post stood proud and true, its base settled into the foundation stones with the patient strength of something that belonged exactly where it was. Tommy moved to examine the remaining corner positions, his small hands tracing lines only he could see. Frame comes first, then walls, then roof. "But Papa says this building's got its own ideas about how it wants to grow." As if summoned by his words, a distant rumble echoed across the forest, the diesel growl of heavy machinery starting up somewhere beyond the ridge. Maggie's stomach clenched with familiar anxiety, but she forced herself to remain focused on the work at hand. The chainsaws would arrive when they arrived. Until then, she had materials that wanted to become something meaningful and hands that were finally learning how to listen. They worked through the morning with increasing rhythm, each joint teaching her something new about the conversation between maker and material. The northeast corner post came from timber that had grown in protected valley soil, its grain dense and patient, willing to bear weight for decades without complaint. The beam that would connect them had weathered lightning strikes and ice storms, its surface scarred but its core uncompromised. "It's like each piece has a personality," Maggie observed as they positioned the connecting beam. "This one's stubborn but reliable. That one's flexible but strong. Papa says that's how you know you're building right, when every piece feels like it chose to be there." Tommy guided her chisel as she cut the tenon that would complete their second major joint. Grammy Nora understood that. She'd spend hours talking to boards before she decided where they belonged. The mention of her grandmother sent unexpected warmth through Maggie's chest. She could almost see the elderly woman moving through this same clearing 50 years earlier, her weathered hands testing timber, her architect's eye measuring possibilities that extended far beyond conventional blueprints. Grammy Nora had tried to teach these lessons through stories and sketches, but Maggie had been too young and too eager to prove herself through grand gestures and dramatic achievements. By midday, they had 3 corners raised and braced, the beginning of a structure that felt both substantial and graceful. But as Maggie stepped back to assess their progress, the rumble of machinery grew noticeably louder. Through the trees, she caught glimpses of orange hard hats and reflective vests, the logging crew positioning equipment, mapping access routes, preparing for Monday's systematic destruction. "They're getting closer," she said, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. Tommy nodded without stopping his work on the 4th corner post. "Papa says that's why some buildings matter more than others, not because they last longer, but because they remember what it feels like to be built with love instead of fear." The words hit Maggie like a physical blow, sudden and breathless. Love. When had she last built anything with love? The hospital had been constructed with ambition, professional pride, the desperate need to prove herself worthy of major commissions. Her earlier career had been driven by recognition, awards, the competitive hunger that marked successful architects. But love? She thought of the children who should have been healed in rooms her design had made impossible. The families whose trust she had unknowingly betrayed through corners cut and warnings unheeded. The workers whose safety had depended on structural integrity she had been too arrogant to verify personally. "I don't know if I remember how," she whispered. Tommy looked up from his corner post, his ancient eyes reflecting depths of patience that belonged to someone much older than 8 years. "You remembered this morning when you listened to what the mortise joint wanted instead of forcing it to be what you needed. You remembered when you felt that beam's weight and knew it wanted to carry something important." Around them, the forest rustled with afternoon wind, but underneath the natural sounds, Maggie heard something else, the whisper of possibilities, the quiet conversation between materials and maker that she was finally learning to recognize. The structure they were building might not survive Monday's chainsaws, but the understanding it represented could not be cut down or burned or sold to satisfy debt. She picked up the chisel again, testing its weight against her palm. 4 days remaining. 4 days to learn what Grammy Nora had spent a lifetime understanding, what Tommy's mysterious presence had been trying to teach her since that first impossible morning when perfect timber had appeared where none should exist. 4 days to finish a conversation that began with collapse and might end with something strong enough to honor both the materials and the maker. The machinery rumbled closer, but her hands remained steady on the tools. The final test. The machinery rumbled closer, but her hands remained steady on the tools. By evening, they had the basic frame skeleton rising from the foundation, like the bones of something that had always belonged in this clearing. But as shadows lengthened and the Coleman lantern cast dancing light across their work, the diesel growl beyond the ridge shifted into a new configuration, multiple engines, heavy equipment being positioned for optimal access. The logging crew wasn't just preparing anymore. They were staging for immediate action. "They're not waiting until Monday," Maggie said, her voice cutting through the mountain silence. Tommy paused in his work, his small hands stilling on the beam he'd been measuring. For the first time since she'd known him, uncertainty flickered across his ancient features. Papa says they changed their minds about something. Got new orders, maybe, or found a reason to move faster. Through the trees, arc lights suddenly blazed to life, turning patches of forest into harsh theatrical stages where orange-vested figures moved with purposeful efficiency. The whine of chainsaws echoed across the valley. Not the systematic cutting of Monday's planned harvest, but the quick, brutal sound of clearing access roads. "How long do we have?" Maggie asked, though part of her already knew the answer from the way Tommy's shoulders had tensed beneath his oversized flannel shirt. "Tomorrow morning, maybe less." His voice carried the weight of someone delivering news that would change everything. "They're cutting a road straight through the heart of the property. Won't stop for cabin frames or foundation stones or anything else that gets in their way." The words should have shattered her. 3 days stolen, impossible deadline compressed to mere hours, all their careful work about to be reduced to expensive kindling. But instead of panic, Maggie felt something she hadn't experienced since the hospital collapse, the crystalline focus that came when everything unnecessary burned away, leaving only what truly mattered. "Then we finish tonight," she said, surprised by the calm certainty in her voice. Tommy's eyes widened. "Maggie, we can't build a whole cabin in one night, even with Papa helping, even with materials that want to cooperate. There's too much work, too many joints, too many—" "Not the whole cabin," she interrupted, moving to the lumber stacks with sudden purpose. "The heart of it, the part that matters most." She selected a beam that seemed to pulse with interior light, its grain running straight and true despite decades of mountain weather. This piece had grown slowly, patiently, accumulating strength ring by ring until it became capable of bearing weight that would have crushed faster-growing wood. Like the understanding she'd been building since that first morning when her branch structures collapsed. Slow accumulation of wisdom that couldn't be rushed or forced. "Papa says you're thinking about something specific," Tommy observed, moving to help her position the beam. The hospital had a children's wing that was supposed to be the centerpiece, a great room where kids could play and families could gather, with windows facing the mountains and beams strong enough to hold the weight of hope. Maggie's hands found the familiar rhythm of measuring and marking, but now her movements carried intention that reached beyond mere construction. "I designed it to be beautiful, but I never made sure it would be safe." She began cutting what would become the central joint of their structure, not a corner connection or foundation anchor, but the heart beam that would carry everything else. The chisel moved with precision she'd never achieved before, removing wood in clean curls that fell like benedictions around her feet. "This building can't heal those children," she continued, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "It can't undo my failure or bring back what I destroyed. But it can remember what I was trying to build before I stopped listening to what the materials needed." Around them, the arc lights grew brighter and the machinery sounds more urgent. But within their circle of lantern light, time seemed to slow and concentrate, each cut becoming a prayer, each joint a promise. Tommy worked beside her with the focused intensity of someone much older, his small hands guiding tools with impossible expertise, his presence somehow amplifying her own growing confidence. "The road crew's moving faster," he said quietly as chainsaw echoes grew closer. "They'll be here before dawn." "Then we build until dawn," Maggie replied, testing the joint she'd just completed. Perfect fit, clean lines, the kind of connection that would hold for decades if given the chance. And if they cut this down, at least it will have been built right. The central beam slid into place with satisfying precision, and suddenly their frame transformed from collection of posts into the skeleton of something larger, a structure that promised shelter, gathering space, the possibility of healing that honored both materials and maker. Tommy smiled, and for a moment his ancient eyes reflected not just patience, but joy. "Now you're building the way Papa always dreamed," he whispered as the chainsaws roared closer through the darkness. The chainsaws fell silent. In the sudden absence of mechanical noise, the mountain darkness pressed close around their pool of lantern light like something alive and watchful. Maggie's hands stilled on the beam she'd been planing, every nerve alert to the unnatural quiet that had replaced the steady growl of approaching destruction. "Why did they stop?" she whispered. Tommy's face had gone pale in the flickering light, his ancient eyes reflecting something that might have been fear. The first time she'd seen such an expression cross his features. "They found something," he said quietly, "or someone found them." Through the trees, harsh voices carried on the night air, not the casual conversation of work crews, but sharp exchanges edged with confusion and growing anger. Arc lights swung wildly as unseen figures moved through the forest, their beams cutting chaotic patterns against the pine canopy. Where the hell did this road come from? The voice was clear enough now to make out individual words, tinged with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This isn't on any of our surveys." "Sir, it's not on the county maps either," came a younger voice, uncertain and worried. "But it's definitely a road. Graded, drained, built to last. Runs right through the middle of the cutting zone." Maggie exchanged glances with Tommy, whose small face had taken on an expression of grim satisfaction. "Papa's been busy," he murmured. "The timber's wrong too," continued the first voice, anger replacing confusion. "These trees are marked for harvest, but half of them show signs of historical cutting. Professional work, probably 40, 50 years old, like someone's been selectively logging this area for decades." The arc lights were moving closer now, sweeping beams that probed between tree trunks with increasing urgency. Maggie could hear boots on pine needles, the metallic clink of equipment, the rustling sounds of men moving through undergrowth in the darkness. "Pack up," Tommy said suddenly, his voice carrying an authority that belonged to someone much older than 8 years. "Everything important. Now." "What about the frame?" Maggie gestured toward their half-completed structure, the heart beam still waiting for its supporting members. "We can't just abandon—" "The frame's not what matters anymore." Tommy was already moving, gathering tools with practiced efficiency. "What matters is what you learned building it. What matters is whether you can carry that understanding somewhere safe." The voices were close enough now that individual words cut through the forest silence like blade strokes. "Property survey shows clear title. Environmental impact was approved. Someone's been tampering with our markers." And underneath those harsh professional tones, something else. A deeper voice that seemed to come from the mountains themselves, calm and implacable as stone. "This land is not for cutting." Maggie's blood went cold. She knew that voice, had heard it in dreams and half-remembered stories, in the echo of Tommy's words when he spoke of Papa's plans and Papa's promises. But this was the first time she'd heard it directly, and it carried the weight of someone who would not be moved by surveys or contracts or the brutal mathematics of commercial forestry. "Tommy," she whispered, but the boy was no longer beside her. The arc lights swept closer, their beams now reaching into the edges of their clearing. In seconds, the work crews would discover the cabin frame, the precisely cut lumber, the evidence of construction that shouldn't exist on property marked for immediate harvest. And behind those lights came the sound of heavy boots, multiple figures moving with the coordinated urgency of men whose plans had been disrupted by forces they didn't understand. Maggie grabbed her tool roll and the Coleman lantern, but as she turned to flee, her eyes fell on the central beam they'd spent hours positioning and joining. Moonlight caught its surface, revealing grain patterns that seemed to pulse with interior light, decades of growth concentrated into timber that wanted to carry weight, wanted to shelter, wanted to remember what building could mean when materials and maker worked in harmony. She couldn't leave it. Not after everything it had taught her about listening, about patience, about the conversation between failure and redemption that could only happen when someone finally learned to build with love instead of fear. "Miss Holloway," the voice came from directly behind her, calm and professional and utterly implacable. "Step away from the structure." She turned to face arc lights that blazed like small suns, washing out everything beyond their harsh perimeter. Behind the lights, shadows moved with mechanical precision, hard hats, reflective vests, the anonymous efficiency of men whose job was to remove obstacles rather than understand them. "This is private property," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "You have no right—" "We have every right, ma'am. Logging contract signed by the legal owner, environmental clearances filed and approved, county permits in order." The voice never wavered, never acknowledged that anything unusual had occurred. "This structure is an illegal impediment to contracted work. You have 30 seconds to clear the area before we begin removal." The chainsaws roared back to life, drowning out everything else in mechanical fury that promised to reduce timber and dreams to identical fragments. The chainsaws roared back to life, drowning out everything else in mechanical fury that promised to reduce timber and dreams to identical fragments. Maggie's hand found the central beam, its surface warm beneath her palm despite the October cold. The grain patterns seemed to pulse against her skin, decades of patient growth, careful selection, joints cut with love instead of haste. Everything she'd learned about listening to materials, about building with intention rather than ego, condensed into this single piece of timber that had chosen to be here. 30 seconds, ma'am." The foreman's voice cut through the chainsaw noise with bureaucratic finality. She could run, grab her tools and disappear into the forest darkness where Tommy waited, carrying the understanding they'd built together to some safer place. The frame would be destroyed, but the knowledge would survive. The practical choice, the sensible choice, the choice that would abandon everything Tommy's presence had been trying to teach her. "No," she said, her voice barely audible above the mechanical roar. "Ma'am, you need to move now. We're not responsible for—" I said no. She stepped closer to the beam, spreading her arms to shelter as much of the structure as possible. "This timber isn't yours to cut." The foreman emerged from behind the arc lights, his face hard with the patience of someone accustomed to removing human obstacles along with natural ones. "Ma'am, you're trespassing on contracted work. The property owner signed legal documents." "I am the property owner." The words emerged with quiet certainty that surprised even her. "Margaret Holloway. This was my grandmother's land." She saw confusion flicker across his features, quickly replaced by professional skepticism. "The contracts were signed by a Margaret Holloway, but you expected someone younger, someone who could be intimidated." She kept her hands on the beam, feeling its grain like a heartbeat beneath her palms. "Someone who didn't understand what this timber represents." Behind the foreman, chainsaw operators waited with engines idling, orange sparks from their exhaust pipes, casting hellish light across the clearing. The smell of diesel fuel and hot metal filled the mountain air, mechanical violence poised to erase 3 days of careful building in 3 minutes of systematic destruction. "Ma'am, these contracts are legally binding. The timber has been sold, permits have been filed, equipment scheduled. You can't just change your mind because I remembered something I'd forgotten." Maggie's voice carried across the clearing with surprising strength. "My grandmother didn't leave me this land to be harvested. She left it to be honored." The foreman pulled out a radio, speaking in rapid professional code that would summon supervisors, lawyers, probably sheriff's deputies. But his words faded into background noise as Maggie felt the beam's warmth spreading through her chest. Not just the heat of living wood, but the accumulated intention of everyone who had touched this timber with respect rather than greed. Tommy's impossible knowledge, Grammy Nora's patient stories, the mysterious Papa whose presence had guided every joint and measurement, all of it flowing through this single piece of mountain pine that had grown slowly enough to bear the weight of hope. "The money," she whispered, understanding finally breaking over her like cold water. The foreman paused his radio conversation. "What?" "The contract payment. I spent it on materials, on tools, on everything we used to build this frame." She gestured toward the structure that rose around them like cathedral bones. "I don't have it anymore. Can't return what I don't have." His face went hard with the realization that this wouldn't be resolved by simple intimidation. "Ma'am, breach of contract carries serious legal consequences. The company has invested significant resources based on your agreement." "Then let them sue me." The words came out steady and sure, each one a nail in the coffin of her old life. Add it to the hospital settlement, the malpractice judgment, everything else I owe. What's one more debt when measured against this? She pressed both palms against the central beam, feeling its surface rough and honest beneath her touch. This timber had waited 40 years to become part of something meaningful. It deserved better than reduction to anonymous lumber, better than sale to cover debts accumulated through pride and carelessness. The chainsaw engines revved higher, operators growing impatient with delay. But Maggie remained motionless, human shield protecting timber that had learned to carry weight through patient growth rather than forced speed. Around her, the frame waited, unfinished but somehow complete, its essential promise intact despite missing walls and roof. "You're throwing away your future for a pile of wood," the foreman said, his professional mask slipping to reveal genuine bewilderment. "No," Maggie replied, thinking of children who would never play in rooms she'd designed, of families whose trust she'd betrayed through corners cut and warnings ignored. "I'm finally building something that honors both the materials and the maker." The radio crackled with voices demanding immediate action. Behind the arc lights, equipment moved with mechanical inevitability toward timber that wanted to shelter rather than profit. But Maggie held her ground, choosing love over fear for the first time since Grammy Nora's stories had taught her that some things mattered more than success. The standoff stretched through the darkness like a taut wire, 40 tons of logging equipment held at bay by one woman's refusal to step aside. The foreman spoke into his radio with increasing urgency, his words sharp and clipped as he explained the situation to supervisors who had expected routine timber extraction, not human barricades protecting half-built dreams. "Legal says we can't proceed with the property owner physically obstructing," he reported, frustration bleeding through his professional composure. "Need sheriff's department for removal, potential arrest for contract violation." Maggie felt the words wash over her without impact. The central beam's warmth had spread through her chest like brandy, carrying with it a certainty she hadn't experienced since the morning she'd first picked up Grammy Nora's old tools. Around her the frame rose into the darkness, incomplete but somehow perfect, its essential structure sound despite missing walls and weatherproofing. From the forest edge came the soft sound of approaching footsteps, and Tommy emerged into the harsh circle of arc lights. He moved with the measured calm of someone who belonged here, his worn cowboy boots making no sound on the pine needles, his too large hat casting deep shadows across features that seemed older than 8 years should allow. "Tommy, get back," Maggie whispered, but he shook his head. "Papa says it's time," he replied, his voice carrying that strange double quality. Child's timbre layered over something ancient and patient. Time to show them what this land remembers. The logging crew shifted uneasily as the boy approached, their confidence wavering in the face of his impossible composure. Behind them, chainsaws idled with mechanical hunger, but the operators seemed reluctant to rev their engines while the child stood watching. "Son, this is a dangerous work site," the foreman said, his authority uncertain for the first time. "You need to get clear of the area." Tommy ignored him completely, moving instead to lay one small hand on the central beam beside Maggie's. Where his palm touched the timber, the grain patterns seemed to brighten, as if interior light were responding to familiar contact. "This beam came from the north slope," he said conversationally, his words pitched to carry across the clearing. "Grew for 63 years before Papa marked it for harvest. Waited another 47 years before Miss Maggie learned to listen to what it wanted to become." The foreman stared at him. "Kid, you can't possibly know." White pine, but with unusual density from growing at elevation. Cut in October 1923, the same month Papa finished the original homestead cabin. Tommy's fingers traced the wood grain with scientific precision, seasoned in mountain air until it reached perfect moisture content, exactly 12%, which you can verify with any commercial meter. One of the crew members pulled out a digital moisture reader, more from curiosity than professional requirement. The device beeped softly as he pressed its probes against the beam's surface. 12%, he announced, bewilderment clear in his voice. Dead on. Tommy smiled, and in that expression Maggie glimpsed something that made her breath catch. Not childish satisfaction, but the deep contentment of someone whose long patience had finally been vindicated. Papa spent his whole life learning to read timber, the boy continued, his voice taking on that resonant quality that seemed to echo from the mountains themselves. Knew which trees wanted to be shelter, which ones preferred to return their nutrients to the soil, respected the difference. The arc lights flickered suddenly, their harsh brilliance wavering as if power were being drawn away by some unseen demand. In that moment of dimmed illumination, shadows shifted between the trees, not the random dance of wind-moved branches, but purposeful movement that suggested watchers in the darkness. "Sir," one of the crew called nervously, "we're getting some weird readings on the equipment. Chainsaws keep stalling out, hydraulics are sluggish. Might be altitude affecting performance, but—" "It's not altitude," Tommy said quietly. His hand remained on the beam, but his eyes had gone distant, as if he were listening to voices only he could hear. "Papa says this land has given enough. 64 years of selective harvest, careful cutting that honored growth patterns and soil stability, but clear cutting would break something that can't be repaired." The foreman's radio crackled with static, voices from town growing increasingly distorted until only fragments came through. "Sheriff's Department, legal complications, reassess tomorrow." Around them the mountain darkness pressed closer, no longer held at bay by artificial light. The chainsaws coughed and died one by one, their engines unable to maintain combustion, as if the very air had grown too thin to support mechanical fire. "Tommy," Maggie whispered, understanding finally breaking over her like dawn. "Your papa. He's not just helping us build, is he?" The boy looked up at her with eyes that held depths no child should possess, eyes that remembered decades of patient craftsmanship and the weight of promises kept across impossible time. "No, Miss Maggie," he said softly. "He's making sure some things stay built." The logging equipment retreated like steel ghosts into the mountain darkness, their departure marked by the frustrated growl of diesel engines struggling against air that had grown too thin for combustion. Within minutes, the harsh circle of arc lights had faded to distant pinpricks moving down the access road, leaving only the soft hiss of Coleman lanterns and the whisper of wind through pine needles. Tommy remained beside the central beam, his small hands still pressed against timber that seemed to pulse with interior light. In the sudden quiet, Maggie could hear her own heartbeat, rapid and strong with the adrenaline of standing ground against impossible odds. "They'll be back," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. The equipment failure had been too complete, too coordinated to be explained by altitude or coincidence. Tomorrow, with different machinery, legal papers, sheriff's deputies. "Maybe," Tommy agreed, but his voice held the patient certainty of someone who had watched decades pass like seasons. "Or maybe they'll find other forests to harvest, places where the timber doesn't remember being loved." The boy stepped back from the beam, and Maggie felt rather than saw the shift in the clearing's atmosphere, a settling, like a held breath finally released. The frame around them remained unfinished, skeleton walls reaching towards stars that seemed closer now that artificial light no longer competed with their ancient illumination. "I should go," Tommy said quietly. "Papa's work is done here. The rest belongs to you." Panic fluttered in Maggie's chest. "But the cabin isn't finished. The walls, the roof, all the details we planned aren't what mattered." He turned those impossible old eyes on her, and she saw reflected in them not the child who had emerged from the forest carrying perfect timber, but the accumulated wisdom of everyone who had ever built with intention rather than haste. What mattered was teaching you to listen, to trust your hands and the materials they touch, to understand that some failures are just foundations waiting for stronger hearts. He began walking toward the tree line, his worn cowboy boots making no sound on pine needles that should have crunched under any normal child's weight. With each step, he seemed to grow more translucent, as if the moonlight were passing through him rather than reflecting off his surface. "Wait," Maggie's voice caught in her throat. "I don't know if I can finish this alone. What if I make the same mistakes? What if—" Tommy paused at the forest's edge, his figure now barely more substantial than shadow and starlight. "You won't," he said, and his words carried the certainty of someone who had watched her struggle and learn and finally choose love over fear. "Because you've remembered the most important thing Grammy Nora tried to teach you." "What's that?" His smile was the last thing to fade, bright as morning sun on mountain snow. "That building isn't about the builder. It's about the building." And then he was gone, leaving only the whisper of wind through branches and the faint scent of pine sawdust that belonged to forests that had been carefully tended by hands that understood the difference between harvesting and honoring. Maggie stood alone in the clearing, surrounded by the bones of a structure that waited patiently for completion. The central beam gleamed in moonlight that seemed brighter now, its grain patterns clearly visible despite the darkness. Around it, supporting timbers joined in perfect harmony, not the harsh precision of machine-cut lumber, but the subtle variations that proved human hands had guided every measurement. She picked up her tool roll and Coleman lantern, but made no move to leave the clearing. Tomorrow would bring fresh challenges, legal papers, financial consequences, the practical realities of a woman who had chosen timber over money, building over profit. But tonight, in the mountain silence that held the accumulated wisdom of everyone who had ever loved this land enough to tend it properly, she felt something she hadn't experienced since the morning she'd first learned that her hospital design had failed. Peace. Not the peace of problems solved, but the deeper contentment that came from finally understanding what the problems had been trying to teach her. The children who had been hurt when her building collapsed, they deserved better than structures designed to impress rather than shelter. The families who had trusted her expertise, they deserved architects who listened to materials rather than forcing them into submission. The frame around her waited with patient acceptance, its essential structure complete despite missing walls and roof. Like Tommy had said, the rest belonged to her now. Months of careful work, learning to read grain patterns and joint stress, discovering how to build with love instead of fear. She pressed her palm against the central beam one final time, feeling its warmth and the steady certainty of wood that knew its purpose. Then she gathered her tools and walked toward the access road where her truck waited, carrying with her the understanding that some things mattered more than success, and some debts could only be repaid by building something worth the materials invested in its creation. Behind her, the frame stood sentinel against the mountain darkness, patient as stone and twice as enduring. The new beginning. The truck's engine turned over reluctantly in the mountain cold, its mechanical complaints a harsh counterpoint to the silence Maggie was leaving behind. As she drove down the access road, her headlights swept across familiar landmarks, the lightning-split pine where she'd first seen Tommy, the creek crossing where he'd taught her to read the grain in wet timber, the meadow where they'd discussed the difference between building fast and building right. By the time she reached the highway, dawn was breaking over the Rockies, painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold that no architect's rendering could capture. She thought of her apartment in Billings, empty now except for boxes of legal papers and the accumulated debris of a career that had measured success in square footage and profit margins rather than the quiet satisfaction of joints that fit without forcing. 3 days later, she returned to the clearing with her truck loaded not with belongings. Those had been sold or given away, but with materials. Real materials this time, purchased not with timber money, but with the last of her savings account, every board and shingle chosen for its individual character rather than its uniformity. The legal papers from the logging company had arrived that morning, thick with threats and financial consequences that would follow her for years. She'd signed for the certified mail without reading past the first paragraph, then used the envelope to start her campfire. The frame waited exactly as she'd left it, its central beam warm to the touch despite 3 days of October frost. But something had changed in the clearing. Or perhaps the change was in her eyes, finely trained to see what had always been there. The forest pressed close with protective attention, and morning light filtered through the canopy in patterns that seemed almost architectural, as if the trees themselves were offering lessons in how to shelter without dominating. She worked slowly, remembering everything Tommy's impossible hands had taught her. Each board was examined for its grain, its natural tensions, its desire to bear weight or provide protection. Mistakes came, of course, gaps that needed shimming, joints that fought her until she learned to approach them differently, but none of the desperate frustration that had marked her early attempts. When something didn't fit, she listened to what the materials were telling her, rather than forcing them into submission. The walls rose board by board through October's shortening days. She installed a simple wood stove that heated efficiently without the complex ductwork her architect training insisted was necessary. The roof went on with hand-split shingles that overlapped like scales, each one positioned according to principles Grammy Nora had tried to teach a young girl too eager for modern solutions to appreciate traditional wisdom. By the first snow, the cabin was habitable. Not finished, perhaps never truly finished, but solid and warm and honest in its construction. The central beam served as the ridgepole for the main room, its grain patterns forming natural decoration that no amount of purchased ornament could improve. When she lit the oil lamps at dusk, their light caught the wood's subtle variations like candle flame dancing on still water. She'd been living in the cabin for 2 weeks when the letter arrived, forwarded through 3 addresses by a postal service that tracked debts more efficiently than dreams. The return address belonged to the law firm handling the hospital settlement, but the contents surprised her. A family whose daughter had been injured in the collapse wanted to meet, not to add accusations to the legal pile, but to discuss something they called building forward. The meeting took place in Kalispell on a bitter November morning, the family's faces worn with the particular exhaustion that comes from watching a child struggle through recovery. But their eyes held something Maggie hadn't expected to see: understanding. "Sarah talks about becoming an architect," the mother said, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup for warmth. "Not to design buildings that won't fall down. She says that's not the point. To design buildings that help people heal." The father leaned forward. "She wants to know if you'd teach her about listening to materials, about building with intention. She says someone who's learned from failure might understand what success actually means." Maggie felt tears forming for the first time since Tommy's disappearance. Not the bitter tears of guilt she'd carried for months, but something warmer, something that tasted like forgiveness, offered from an unexpected direction. That evening she sat on the cabin's small porch, watching stars emerge over the Rockies, a letter half written on her lap. The words came slowly but surely, each sentence carefully constructed like joints in good timber, an offer to teach what she'd learned, to share the understanding that some kinds of strength came only from accepting help, and that the most important structures were built not to impress, but to shelter what was precious. The mountain silence held her answer like an embrace, and somewhere in the darkness between the trees, she could almost hear the echo of worn cowboy boots walking on pine needles, carrying the quiet satisfaction of work well done and debts finally repaid through love rather than money. Inside the cabin, the central beam held its weight patiently, knowing its purpose at last.